My wife's sister said I didn't belong at family events because I wasn't blood-related. Her apology tour was pathetic. The invitation to my own anniversary party arrived in the mail with my name crossed out in red Sharpie. Not digitally edited, not politely omitted, physically scratched through with enough pressure that the pen had torn through the cardstock in 3 places. Underneath, in Veronica's distinctive looping handwriting, she'd written, "Family only," and underlined it twice. I stood in my kitchen holding this thing, staring at the jagged red lines cutting through Andrew and Natalie, turning it into just Natalie. My wife was at work. The invitation was for a surprise party Veronica was throwing for our 5th wedding anniversary at her house that Saturday. Except apparently I wasn't invited to my own anniversary celebration because I wasn't blood-related to my wife's family. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because my brain couldn't process what I was seeing as real. I'd been married to Natalie for almost 5 years when her sister Veronica decided I didn't count as family anymore. We'd been together for 8 years total, lived together for 6, owned a house together for 3. I'd spent every Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and random Sunday dinner with her parents Margaret and David since we started dating in college. I'd helped Veronica move into 4 different apartments. I'd co-signed a loan for her when she was starting her photography business because the bank wouldn't approve her a loan. I'd spent hours helping her husband Keith install their backyard fence in the summer heat while drinking cheap beer and talking about sports. I'd been in their wedding party. Veronica had been in ours. These people had been my family longer than some of my actual blood relatives had been alive. But sometime in the past 6 months, Veronica had apparently decided that legal marriage and nearly a decade of shared history didn't make me family. Only DNA counted. And she was willing to cross my name off invitations with a red Sharpie to make that point crystal clear. The first sign something was wrong came 4 months earlier at Margaret's birthday dinner. Natalie and I showed up at the restaurant right on time, walked to the private room they'd reserved, and found the entire family already seated and halfway through appetizers. Every seat was taken except 2 chairs that had been pushed against the wall in the corner, clearly set aside and not part of the table arrangement. Veronica stood up immediately when she saw us and said the reservation got changed at the last minute and they could only fit family at the main table, so she'd arranged alternative seating for me. Just me, not Natalie. She gestured to one of the chairs against the wall like she was doing me a favor. Natalie's face went bright red, and she told Veronica to stop being ridiculous. But Veronica just smiled and said she was trying to keep the family table intimate for Margaret's special day. She actually used the word intimate while gesturing at a table that seated 14 people including Keith, who'd married into the family 3 years after I did. Keith was sitting right there at the main table between Veronica and David, drinking wine and looking anywhere except at me. Margaret started to say something, but Veronica cut her off and said she'd handled all the arrangements and knew what was best for the family dynamic. The phrase family dynamic came out of her mouth like she'd been practicing it. Natalie grabbed my hand and said if I wasn't sitting at the table, she wasn't either, and we both sat in those corner chairs for the entire dinner, while everyone else pretended this was normal. I could see Margaret looking over at us every few minutes with this pained expression, but she never said anything. David focused on his food like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. Veronica held court at the head of the table, orchestrating conversation and toasts, making sure everyone knew she was running the show. She kept calling it our family celebration and emphasizing the word our in a way that made it obvious who she meant to exclude. After that dinner, things escalated steadily over the next few months. Veronica started a new family group chat and added everyone except me. When Natalie asked why, Veronica said the chat was for coordinating family matters and I didn't need to be included in family business. Natalie showed me the messages. They were planning a weekend trip to the lake house that Margaret and David owned, discussing who would drive together and what food everyone would bring and what activities they'd do. I'd been going to that lake house for 7 years. I'd helped David replace the dock 2 summers ago. Veronica was in the chat treating it like I'd never existed. When Natalie said she wouldn't go without me, Veronica responded that this was exactly why including non-family members complicated things, because then family members felt torn between family and outsiders. She actually wrote the word outsiders. Keith jumped in to agree with Veronica, saying maybe it would be good to have some family-only time to reconnect with core family bonds. Core family bonds. Like marriage vows and shared mortgages didn't create bonds. The lake trip happened without us. Natalie refused to go, which caused a huge fight in the family chat that I only heard about secondhand. Veronica accused Natalie of choosing her husband over her blood family and said it was unhealthy. Margaret tried to smooth things over by saying everyone was welcome and they'd missed seeing both of us, but Veronica shut that down immediately. She said Margaret needed to stop enabling Natalie's inability to maintain healthy family boundaries. The word enabling stood out to Natalie when she told me about it. Veronica had clearly been reading psychology articles or watching therapy videos online, because she'd started using all this clinical language to justify treating me like I was contaminating the family just by existing in the same space as them. She talked about enmeshment and codependency and the importance of preserving family identity. What she meant was that I wasn't blood-related, and therefore didn't belong at family functions anymore. I tried talking to Keith about it after a few weeks of this treatment. I called him on a weeknight after Natalie had gone to bed, figuring maybe he'd be reasonable since he'd married into the family just like I had. He picked up on the third ring, and I could hear a basketball game in the background. I kept my voice calm and asked him directly what was going on with Veronica and why she was suddenly treating me like an outsider after all these years. Keith was quiet for a long moment. Then he said Veronica had been stressed lately with work and family obligations, and she was just trying to create some structure around family time. I asked him why that structure needed to exclude me specifically when I'd been part of the family longer than he had. He said he understood where I was coming from, but Veronica felt really strongly about maintaining family boundaries, and he supported his wife's feelings. I pointed out that he was sitting at the family table at Margaret's birthday while I got stuck in the corner, and asked him if he saw how messed up that was. He said he had to go and hung up before I could respond. The basketball game kept playing in those few seconds before the line went dead. Things got worse after that call. Veronica must have told Keith to tell her everything I said, because the next family event was even more pointed in my exclusion. David's retirement party was at their house, and when Natalie and I arrived, Veronica met us at the door. She handed Natalie a glass of wine and told me there were beers in the cooler on the back patio, clearly directing me away from where everyone else was gathering in the living room. I walked through the house to get to the back patio and had to pass through the living room anyway. Every seat was taken. Veronica had arranged exactly enough chairs for everyone except me. I grabbed a beer from the cooler outside and stood on the patio alone while I could hear everyone inside laughing and talking and celebrating David's retirement. Natalie came out after 5 minutes looking furious. She said Veronica told her the seating was arranged for family photos, and they'd do photos first. Then I could join for the casual part of the party later. Family photos that I wouldn't be in. At my father-in-law's retirement party. A man I'd known and respected for 8 years. A man whose daughter I'd married and built a life with. Natalie told Veronica we were leaving. Veronica said that was Natalie's choice, but she was disappointed that Natalie kept prioritizing her husband over family events. She said it loud enough that everyone in the living room could hear. Margaret stood up and said that was enough, that I was family too, that this had gone too far. Veronica cut her off and said Margaret didn't understand what it was like to watch family dynamics get diluted by people who didn't share blood bonds. She said she was protecting the family's core identity. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. David was still sitting in his chair looking uncomfortable but not saying anything. Keith was nodding along with whatever Veronica said like a dashboard ornament. Natalie grabbed my hand and we left. We didn't stay for any of David's retirement party. On the drive home, Natalie was crying and saying she didn't understand what happened to her sister, that Veronica had never acted like this before. I drove and didn't say much because I was trying to figure out when exactly I'd stopped being family in Veronica's eyes and started being a threat to their core identity. The breaking point came with the anniversary party invitation. That crossed-out name in red Sharpie was so blatant, so aggressive, so deliberately cruel that I knew this wasn't just Veronica being stressed or having boundary issues. This was targeted. This was personal. She was throwing a party specifically to celebrate my marriage to her sister and had physically removed my name from the invitation because she didn't consider me family enough to attend. I took a photo of the invitation and texted it to Natalie at work. She called me back within 30 seconds. I could hear her moving somewhere private, a door closing, then her voice shaking with rage, asking me if this was a joke. I told her I was holding the actual invitation in my hand right now. She said she was leaving work and coming home. I said she didn't need to do that, but she'd already hung up. She walked through our front door 20 minutes later, grabbed the invitation off the kitchen counter where I'd left it, and stared at it like she was trying to make sense of a foreign language. Natalie called Veronica right there in our kitchen, put it on speaker. Veronica answered on the second ring, sounding cheerful, and asking if Natalie had gotten the invitation. Natalie's voice was ice cold when she asked why my name was crossed out. Veronica said she'd been thinking a lot about family structure lately and realized they needed to start honoring blood bonds more intentionally. She said the anniversary party was a perfect opportunity to celebrate Natalie's commitment to family, meaning her family of origin, separate from romantic relationships. Natalie asked if Veronica understood that an anniversary party was specifically celebrating a marriage, which was a romantic relationship. Veronica said that's exactly why it was important to frame it as a family celebration of Natalie's journey rather than a couple's celebration. She wanted to honor Natalie's place in the family without diluting it with non-family presence. Those were her exact words. Non-family presence. Like I was some kind of contaminant. Natalie told Veronica she was out of her mind and hung up. Then she threw the invitation in the trash and said we needed to do something about this before it got even worse. We decided to involve a professional. Natalie found a family therapist named Dr. Raymond Foster, who specialized in family systems and relationship dynamics. Dr. Foster had a practice in the city, 20 years of experience, and had written 2 books on family conflict resolution. We booked a session for the following week, and Natalie sent a message to the family group chat that I wasn't in, telling everyone we were seeing a therapist about the family situation and inviting anyone who wanted to participate to join us. Veronica responded immediately saying therapy was a great idea for people who needed help processing their feelings, but she didn't feel the need to justify her boundaries to a therapist. Margaret said she'd come to a session. David said he'd think about it. Keith said he'd support whatever Veronica decided. The session ended up being me, Natalie, and Margaret sitting in Dr. Foster's office the following Thursday evening, while he took notes and asked questions about family history and recent conflicts. Dr. Foster was in his early 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a cardigan that looked like it had come from an academic's closet. His office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, shelves full of books about family psychology and trauma, a small table with a box of tissues that I suspected got used frequently. He started by asking each of us to describe our understanding of the current family conflict without interrupting each other. Margaret went first. She said her daughter Veronica had recently started excluding her son-in-law Andrew from family events, and she didn't understand why. She said I'd been nothing but kind and supportive to the whole family for years, that I'd been there for every important moment, that Veronica's behavior was causing division and pain for everyone. Her voice cracked when she said she felt like she was losing both her daughters because of this, one to anger and one to confusion about what was happening. Dr. Foster nodded and took notes. Then Natalie spoke. Natalie described the progression of exclusions over the past 4 months, the corner chairs at her mother's birthday dinner, the lake trip group chat that I wasn't added to, the retirement party where I was directed to the patio while everyone else gathered inside for family photos, the anniversary invitation with my name crossed out. She showed Dr. Foster the photo of the invitation on her phone. He asked if he could see the original, and Natalie said she'd thrown it away, but could retrieve it from the trash if needed. He said the photo was sufficient for now. He asked Natalie how this pattern of exclusion had affected her relationship with her sister. Natalie said they barely spoke anymore because every conversation turned into an argument about family boundaries and blood bonds. She said Veronica had started using therapeutic language to justify excluding me, talking about enmeshment and codependency, accusing Natalie of choosing her husband over her family like those were mutually exclusive categories. Dr. Foster wrote something in his notebook that I couldn't see from my angle. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my voice level and factual. I described my relationship with Natalie's family over the past 8 years, the ways I'd been involved and contributed and shown up for everyone. I talked about co-signing Veronica's business loan, helping Keith with their fence, replacing David's dock, attending every family function and holiday for nearly a decade. I said I'd always felt welcomed and accepted until about 4 months ago, when Veronica abruptly started treating me like I was contaminating the family by being present. I told Dr. Foster about the conversation with Keith, where he'd refused to acknowledge how messed up the situation was. I said I felt confused and hurt, because I didn't understand what I'd done to trigger this sudden change in how Veronica saw me. Dr. Foster asked if there had been any major life events or changes around the time the exclusion started. I looked at Natalie. She looked at Margaret. Margaret's face went pale and she said she thought she might know what triggered this. Margaret explained that about 5 months ago she'd been diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. Treatable, good prognosis, but it had shaken the whole family. She'd told her daughters right away, and they'd both reacted differently. Natalie had been supportive and practical, researching treatment options and doctors and offering to go to appointments. Veronica had become intensely focused on family legacy and making sure family bonds were strong enough to withstand potential loss. She'd started talking about the importance of blood relatives sticking together and preserving family identity across generations. Margaret said she'd thought Veronica was just processing her fear about the cancer diagnosis, but now she wondered if that fear had morphed into this crusade to exclude anyone who wasn't blood-related. Dr. Foster asked if Veronica had expressed these concerns directly. Margaret said Veronica had told her that going through something like cancer made her realize what really mattered, and what really mattered was keeping the core family unit strong and undiluted. Margaret had thought she meant emotionally strong, not literally excluding people from events. Dr. Foster sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Then he said that what we were describing sounded like a trauma response that had become maladaptive. He explained that when people face mortality threats, either their own or a loved one's, they sometimes respond by trying to create rigid boundaries around who counts as their inner circle. It's a psychological defense mechanism meant to reduce the feeling of vulnerability by controlling who has access to their emotional energy. In Veronica's case, her mother's cancer diagnosis had apparently triggered an intense need to define family in the most restrictive possible terms, excluding anyone who didn't share biological ties. The problem, Dr. Foster said, was that this type of defensive exclusion doesn't actually protect anyone. It just causes harm to relationships and creates exactly the kind of family fracturing that Veronica claimed to be trying to prevent. He said Veronica would need to participate in therapy to work through her trauma response, but she'd have to choose to do that herself. We couldn't force her to recognize that her behavior was destructive. We left that session with Margaret crying in the parking lot and Natalie holding her while I stood there feeling useless. Dr. Foster had given us some strategies for setting boundaries with Veronica and maintaining our own relationships with other family members, but none of it addressed the core problem that Veronica had decided I wasn't family and was willing to blow up every relationship in her path to enforce that belief. Margaret kept apologizing, saying she never meant for her diagnosis to cause this kind of chaos, that she'd thought Veronica was handling things well. Natalie told her this wasn't her fault, that Veronica was responsible for her own actions regardless of what triggered them. I drove us home in silence while Natalie held her mother's hand in the back seat, and I thought about how a cancer diagnosis I hadn't even known about until today had apparently been the catalyst for me being erased from my own family. The anniversary party happened without us. Veronica sent Natalie a text the morning of saying she hoped Natalie would reconsider and join the celebration, that family was there to support her. No mention of me. Natalie didn't respond. We spent our actual anniversary that Saturday doing what we wanted, which was driving up the coast to a bed and breakfast we liked and having dinner at a seafood restaurant where nobody cared about blood bonds or family identity. We turned off our phones for the entire weekend. When we turned them back on Sunday night, there were 32 missed calls and over 50 text messages. Most were from numbers we didn't recognize. A few were from Margaret and David. None were from Veronica directly, but several were from people we barely knew, saying they'd heard about our anniversary and hoped we were doing well. It took us a while to figure out what had happened. Veronica had posted about the anniversary party on social media. She'd made a Facebook post with photos from the party showing the decorations and cake and family members gathered around a table with a framed photo of Natalie in the center. The caption was a long paragraph about celebrating her sister's 5th anniversary and honoring family bonds that transcend individual relationships. She'd tagged Natalie and a bunch of other family members, but not me. People who knew us both had started commenting, asking where I was, why there was a photo of Natalie instead of a photo of Natalie and me, whether we'd separated. Veronica had responded to several comments saying the party was focused on celebrating Natalie's place in the family rather than her marriage specifically. Someone had asked point blank if I'd been invited, and Veronica had responded that the event was for blood family only. That comment had started a wildfire. People were tagging us, asking what was going on. Friends were sending direct messages, asking if we were okay. Natalie's college roommate had called her mother to ask if we'd gotten divorced. The whole thing had spiraled into public speculation about our marriage, because Veronica had thrown an anniversary party that excluded one half of the couple being celebrated. Natalie called Veronica from our bedroom while I sat on the couch scrolling through the Facebook comments. I could hear Natalie's side of the conversation through the closed door, her voice getting progressively louder as she demanded to know what Veronica was thinking posting about our anniversary, while deliberately excluding me from the event and the photos and the entire narrative. There was a long pause where I assumed Veronica was talking. Then Natalie shouted something I couldn't make out, then another pause. Then Natalie said she was done protecting Veronica from the consequences of her behavior. The bedroom door opened, and Natalie came out holding her phone, her face red and her hands shaking. She said Veronica had just told her that I could attend future family events if I was willing to sign a document acknowledging that I wasn't a core family member and would respect when family-only time was designated. An actual legal document. Veronica had apparently consulted with a lawyer friend about drafting something she called a family participation agreement that would formalize the boundaries between blood family and married-in members. Natalie showed me the text where Veronica had sent a photo of a draft document with sections about respecting family hierarchy and not interfering with blood relative decision-making. I looked at this document on Natalie's phone screen and started laughing. Not the confused laugh from when I saw the crossed-out invitation. This was something closer to hysterical disbelief that someone could be this delusional. The document had an actual header that said, Family Participation Agreement, in bold letters. Below that was a preamble about preserving family integrity and honoring biological bonds. Then there were numbered sections outlining things like, non-blood participants agree to defer to blood family members on all family decisions, and non-blood participants acknowledge they attend family events as guests of their blood-related spouse and may be asked to leave if family-only discussions are required, and non-blood participants will not challenge family hierarchy or attempt to claim equal status with blood relatives. At the bottom was a signature line for me and a witness signature line. Veronica had created a legal-looking document that would make me a second-class citizen in my own family, and she genuinely thought I would sign it. Natalie called Margaret and David right there in our living room, put them on speaker, and read sections of the family participation agreement out loud. There was complete silence on the other end for at least 15 seconds after she finished. Then David said something I'd never heard him say before. He said, "What the hell is wrong with her?" His voice was shaking. Margaret was crying. David said they needed to have a family meeting immediately, tonight, with everyone present, and this was going to stop now. He'd been quiet through most of Veronica's escalating behavior, trying to keep the peace, but apparently a legal document declaring me a lesser member of the family was the line he wouldn't let her cross. He said he was calling Veronica right now and telling her to be at their house in 1 hour, and we should come too, and Keith needed to be there as well. Margaret said she was calling her brother Paul, who was a family law attorney, to get his perspective on whether this document Veronica had created could even be legally binding. The call ended with plans for everyone to meet at Margaret and David's house at 8 o'clock that evening. The drive to Margaret and David's took 35 minutes, and neither Natalie nor I spoke for most of it. We were both trying to process that this situation had escalated to the point where Veronica had consulted a lawyer about creating a formal agreement to codify my exclusion from the family. When we pulled up to the house, Keith's car was already in the driveway. We walked in without knocking, something I'd done for years, because this had always felt like a second home. David was pacing in the living room. Margaret was sitting on the couch with her laptop open, presumably talking to her brother Paul on a video call. Keith was standing near the fireplace looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Veronica wasn't there yet. David saw us come in and said Veronica had texted that she was on her way, but wanted everyone to know she was coming in good faith to discuss the family agreement she'd proposed. Good faith. Like excluding me from my own anniversary party and creating a legal hierarchy of family members was a good faith gesture. Veronica arrived 15 minutes late carrying a folder with printed copies of her family participation agreement. She handed them out to everyone like we were in a business meeting, completely serious, acting like this was a reasonable solution to a problem that only existed in her head. She started talking before anyone else could, saying she'd spent a lot of time thinking about how to preserve family cohesion while acknowledging the reality that not everyone had the same connection to the family core. She said blood relationships were permanent and legally recognized, while marriages could end at any time, so it made sense to create some boundaries that protected the core family from being disrupted if a marriage didn't work out. She looked directly at me when she said that last part. Natalie started to respond, but David held up his hand and said he wanted to speak first. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. David said he'd been married to Margaret for 33 years, and not one day of that marriage had made him feel like less of a family member because he wasn't blood-related. He said when he married into Margaret's family, her parents welcomed him completely and never once treated him like a guest or an outsider or someone who needed to sign an agreement to participate in family life. He said the whole point of marriage was that it created family bonds that were just as real and permanent as blood bonds, and suggesting otherwise wasn't just insulting to me, it was insulting to every person who'd ever married into any family anywhere. He said Veronica's behavior over the past months had been bad enough, but creating a legal document to formalize excluding Andrew was so far over the line that he didn't even know how to address it. He told Veronica she needed to apologize to me, apologize to Natalie, apologize to Margaret, and stop this crusade immediately before she destroyed every relationship she had. Veronica's face went red, and she said David was proving exactly why boundaries were necessary, because he was putting his feelings above what was best for the family's long-term stability. That's when Margaret's brother Paul spoke up from the laptop screen. Attorney Paul Donovan, 32 years practicing family law, specializing in divorce and estate planning. He'd been sitting quietly listening to everything while on the video call. Now he said he needed to address the legal document Veronica had created. He said first, the document wasn't legally binding in any meaningful way because you can't create contracts that restrict someone's family relationships without their consent. Second, even if it were somehow enforceable, it would likely violate several principles of contract law, including unconscionability and lack of consideration. Third, and most importantly, attempting to enforce this kind of agreement could actually create legal problems for Veronica, because it could be interpreted as attempting to alienate affection or interfere with Natalie's marital relationship. He said in some jurisdictions, that kind of interference could have serious legal consequences. He looked directly at the camera and said Veronica needed to destroy every copy of this document and never mention it again if she wanted to avoid potential legal liability. Veronica stared at the laptop screen like Paul had just spoken in a foreign language. Keith finally spoke up and said maybe they should take Paul's advice seriously since he was an actual attorney and knew what he was talking about. Veronica spun around and told Keith to stop undermining her in front of her family. Keith's face went white, and he said he was just trying to help her avoid making things worse. She said things wouldn't be worse if people would just respect her boundaries. Margaret stood up from the couch, and her voice was shaking when she said she'd stayed quiet too long about this behavior, that she'd made excuses about Veronica processing the cancer diagnosis, but this had gone way beyond any reasonable trauma response. She said watching her daughter try to legally exclude her son-in-law from the family was breaking her heart. She said Veronica needed professional help working through whatever was driving this obsession with blood bonds, and until she got that help, Margaret and David wouldn't be participating in any family events that excluded me. She looked at me when she said it, and her eyes were full of tears. Veronica stood there holding her folder of family participation agreements, looking at each person in the room like she was waiting for someone to back her up. Nobody did. Keith was staring at the floor. David had his arms crossed. Margaret was crying. Paul was watching from the laptop with a concerned expression. I was standing next to Natalie near the doorway trying to decide if I should say something or let the family handle this themselves. Veronica's hands started shaking, and she said she was only trying to protect everyone from getting hurt, that she'd seen what happened when families got too diluted and lost their core identity, that her friend Stephanie had gone through a divorce, and her ex-husband's family had to navigate complicated relationships afterward. She said she was being proactive about preventing that kind of mess in their family. Natalie asked Veronica directly why she thought our marriage was going to end in divorce. Veronica didn't answer. Natalie asked again, louder. Veronica said she didn't think it would necessarily end in divorce, but statistically, marriages had a high failure rate, and it made sense to plan accordingly. Natalie told Veronica she was delusional, and we were leaving. We walked out of Margaret and David's house at 9:30 that night, and I never wanted to go back. Not because of Margaret or David, but because being in that house meant potentially running into Veronica and her folders full of family hierarchy documents. Natalie drove home this time because my hands were shaking too much to hold the steering wheel steady. Neither of us talked about what had just happened until we got home and were sitting in our own living room with the door locked and the curtains closed like we needed to hide from the world for a while. Natalie said she'd never seen her father that angry before. I said I'd never heard a lawyer tell someone their family boundaries might be legally actionable before. We sat there in silence for a few minutes. Then Natalie said she wanted to go no contact with Veronica until Veronica got actual therapy and acknowledged how harmful her behavior had been. I said I'd support whatever decision Natalie made about her relationship with her sister. Natalie started crying and said she felt like she'd lost her sister to some kind of psychological breakdown that nobody could fix. The next few weeks were quiet. Veronica didn't contact either of us directly. Margaret called every few days to check on Natalie and apologize again for not shutting down Veronica's behavior earlier. David sent me a text saying he was sorry for how I'd been treated and that I'd always be family to him regardless of what Veronica thought. Keith reached out once asking if we could all sit down and talk through things calmly, but when Natalie asked if that meant Veronica was ready to apologize and seek therapy, Keith said Veronica felt she was being ganged up on and needed time before she could engage in productive conversation. Natalie told Keith that wasn't good enough and ended the call. We settled into a new normal where Natalie's family gatherings were split. We saw Margaret and David separately from Veronica and Keith. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being excluded from events or being asked to sign family participation agreements. Then Margaret's cancer treatment schedule got more intensive. She'd been doing well with the initial treatment, but her oncologist, Dr. Patricia Hayes, recommended a more aggressive approach to make sure they got everything. Dr. Hayes was a specialist at the University Medical Center, 26 years of experience in oncology, known for her thorough treatment plans. The new treatment meant Margaret would need someone with her at appointments for the next several weeks because the medication made her drowsy and she couldn't drive herself home. David had to work and couldn't take that much time off. Natalie had already been going to most appointments, but her work schedule didn't allow her to make all of them. Veronica volunteered immediately in the family group chat, the one I still wasn't in. Margaret called Natalie directly and asked if I would be willing to take her to some of the Thursday afternoon appointments, since those were the ones Natalie and Veronica couldn't cover. Natalie asked me that night at dinner if I'd be okay doing that given everything that had happened with Veronica. I said Margaret was family, and I'd do whatever she needed. The first appointment I took Margaret to was on a Thursday in late November. I picked her up at her house at 1:30 and drove her to the medical center while we made small talk about the weather and the holiday plans that felt complicated now with the family split. She thanked me for doing this and said she knew it was probably awkward given the situation with Veronica. I told her it wasn't awkward at all, that I wanted to be there for her. We sat in the waiting room for 20 minutes before they called her back. I went with her into the treatment room because she'd asked me to, said it helped having someone there to remember what the doctor said since the medication made her foggy afterward. Dr. Hayes came in with a nurse named Linda and explained the treatment process for that day. They'd be administering the medication intravenously. It would take about 90 minutes, and Margaret would likely feel tired and possibly nauseous afterward. They hooked up the IV and started the medication. Margaret and I sat there talking about nothing important while the medication dripped into her arm, and I tried not to think about how Veronica would react if she knew I was here. Veronica found out I was taking Margaret to appointments when she showed up at the medical center during the third treatment session. I was sitting in the treatment room with Margaret while the IV dripped, reading a magazine and half listening to Margaret talk about a recipe she wanted to try for Thanksgiving. The door opened, and Veronica walked in holding coffee cups, clearly expecting to find her mother alone or with Natalie. She froze when she saw me sitting there. Her face went through several expressions in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, anger. She asked Margaret what I was doing there. Margaret said I was taking her to the appointments when Natalie and Veronica couldn't make it. Veronica said she wasn't told that I was filling in on appointment days. Margaret said it hadn't occurred to her that she needed permission to choose who took her to medical appointments. Veronica set the coffee cups down hard enough that some liquid sloshed out of the lids. She said this was exactly the problem she'd been trying to address with the family participation agreement, that non-family members were inserting themselves into family medical situations without appropriate boundaries. I stood up from my chair and told Veronica she could take over from here if she wanted, that I'd brought Margaret and could wait in the lobby until the treatment was done. Margaret grabbed my hand and said I wasn't going anywhere, that I'd been kind enough to rearrange my schedule to help her, and she wasn't sending me away because Veronica couldn't handle seeing me in a hospital room. Veronica's voice went up an octave when she said Margaret was choosing Andrew over her own daughter. Margaret's voice stayed calm but firm when she said she wasn't choosing anyone. She was accepting help from family members who offered it, and I was family whether Veronica accepted that or not. Veronica looked at me and said I was manipulating the situation to make her look bad, using her mother's cancer to score points in a family conflict. The nurse Linda, who'd been quietly checking monitors in the corner, cleared her throat loudly and said she needed to ask that we keep voices down because other patients were receiving treatment nearby. Veronica grabbed her coffee cups and left without another word. Margaret squeezed my hand and apologized. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. That confrontation at the medical center triggered something in Veronica. Over the next week, she started contacting extended family members trying to build support for her position. Natalie started getting calls from cousins and aunts asking what was going on with the family conflict, saying Veronica had reached out explaining that there were concerns about my behavior and influence in the family. Veronica was apparently telling people I'd caused division in the family, that I'd turned Natalie against her sister, that I was using Margaret's illness to make Veronica look like the bad person. She was flipping the whole narrative, making herself the victim of my manipulation, instead of acknowledging that she'd spent months excluding me from family events and trying to create legal documents establishing a family hierarchy. Some family members believed her version. Some called Natalie to get the full story. The family fracture was spreading beyond the immediate family to the entire extended network. Margaret's brother Paul called me directly one evening to get my perspective on what was happening. He said Veronica had sent him a long email about family boundaries being violated and asked for his professional opinion on whether I had any legal standing to be involved in Margaret's medical care. He wanted to know if there was any truth to Veronica's claims that I'd overstepped somehow. I explained the full timeline to Paul: the corner chairs at the birthday dinner, the lake trip exclusion, the retirement party patio exile, the crossed-out anniversary invitation, the family participation agreement. I sent him screenshots of the invitation photo and the document Veronica had drafted. Paul was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said he needed to have a serious conversation with Veronica about her behavior, because what she was doing could potentially constitute harassment or intentional infliction of emotional distress if it continued. He said he was going to recommend strongly that she seek therapy to address whatever was driving this obsession with excluding me from the family. 2 days after Paul's call to me, Veronica showed up at our house uninvited. It was Saturday morning around 10. I was in the garage working on organizing our storage shelves when I heard the doorbell. Natalie answered, and I heard Veronica's voice from inside asking if they could talk. I came out of the garage and stood in the hallway where I could see the front door but stayed back from the conversation. Veronica saw me, and her whole body tensed. She told Natalie she'd come to apologize and work things out, but she needed to speak to Natalie privately. Natalie said anything Veronica had to say could be said in front of her husband. Veronica's mouth got tight, and she said fine. She'd come to say she was sorry for how things had escalated lately, that she realized she'd been under a lot of stress with the family situation, and maybe she'd overreacted to some things. It was the most non-apology apology I'd ever heard. She didn't acknowledge any specific behavior. She didn't take responsibility for excluding me or creating the family agreement or any of the months of deliberate cruelty. She just vaguely mentioned that things had escalated and she'd been stressed. Natalie asked Veronica directly what she was apologizing for. Veronica shifted her weight and said she was sorry if her attempts to establish healthy boundaries had come across as hurtful. Like the problem was our interpretation of her behavior rather than the behavior itself. Natalie asked again, what specific actions was Veronica apologizing for? Veronica looked trapped. She said she was sorry for any confusion about family event invitations. Natalie said that wasn't specific enough. Was she sorry for crossing my name off the anniversary invitation? Was she sorry for the family participation agreement? Was she sorry for excluding me from family gatherings for months? Veronica's face flushed, and she said she was trying to apologize here, and Natalie was making it difficult by demanding a detailed list of grievances. Natalie said that's exactly what a real apology required: acknowledgement of specific harm caused. Veronica looked at me and said she was sorry I felt excluded, but that had never been her intention. I felt excluded. Not that she'd actively excluded me, but that I'd somehow independently felt that way. I spoke up for the first time since she'd arrived. I said I didn't feel excluded. I was actively excluded by her choices. There was a difference. She'd physically crossed my name off invitations. She'd created separate group chats without me. She'd directed me to the patio while everyone else gathered inside. She'd drafted a legal document to formalize my second-class status in the family. Those weren't feelings. Those were actions she'd taken. Veronica's jaw clenched, and she said I was being hostile when she was trying to make peace. Natalie said there couldn't be peace without honesty, and Veronica wasn't being honest about what she'd done or why. Veronica said she'd already explained that she was trying to protect the family's core bonds, and if we couldn't accept her apology, that was our choice. Natalie told Veronica that wasn't an apology. It was just more of the same justification she'd been using for months. Veronica left without saying goodbye. Through the window, I watched her sit in her car in our driveway for 5 full minutes before she started the engine and drove away. The pathetic apology tour continued over the next 3 weeks. Veronica sent a card in the mail addressed to both of us with a generic "thinking of you" message and no mention of anything specific. She left a voicemail on Natalie's phone saying she hoped they could move past this difficult time. She sent David to talk to us about giving Veronica another chance, saying family was too important to let conflicts persist. Each attempt was more hollow than the last. Never once did she actually name what she'd done wrong. Never once did she acknowledge the harm she'd caused. Never once did she commit to changing her behavior or seeking therapy to address whatever had triggered her obsession with blood bonds. It was all surface-level, performative reconciliation attempts designed to make her look like she'd tried without actually doing the work of genuine accountability. The breaking point for everyone else came at Thanksgiving. Margaret and David had decided to host, despite Margaret still going through treatment, saying they wanted the family together for the holiday. They made it explicitly clear that I was invited and expected to attend. Veronica and Keith showed up with a sweet potato casserole, and Veronica's jaw dropped when she saw me in the kitchen helping David with the turkey. Margaret intercepted her before she could say anything and told her they were not doing this today, that either Veronica could be civil or she could leave. Veronica plastered on a fake smile and said, of course she could be civil. She'd already apologized for past misunderstandings, like she'd simply mixed up a date or forgotten to send an invitation, not systematically excluded me from family life for months. We made it through dinner with Veronica, making pointed comments about family traditions and asking questions specifically about Margaret's side of the family tree, emphasizing biological connections. Nobody took the bait. Keith looked miserable. After dinner, Veronica announced she had something to share with everyone. She pulled out her phone and started reading from a notes app, something she'd clearly prepared in advance. She said she'd done a lot of reflecting lately about what family meant to her. She said growing up, she'd always felt a deep connection to her bloodline and the generations of women who came before her. She said when her mother was diagnosed with cancer, it made her think about mortality and legacy and what would remain after people were gone. She said the only thing that truly lasted was blood, and she'd been trying to honor that truth in how she approached family relationships. She looked directly at me when she said she understood not everyone would appreciate her perspective on blood bonds, but she hoped in time people would see she'd been trying to protect something precious. Margaret set down her fork hard enough that it clanked against the plate and told Veronica to stop. Just stop. This wasn't reflection. This was the same justification repackaged with more sentimental language. David said if Veronica couldn't participate in a family holiday without making speeches about blood bonds and exclusion, maybe she needed to leave. Veronica's face crumpled, and she started crying, saying everyone was ganging up on her for trying to share her feelings. Keith put his hand on her shoulder and suggested maybe they should go. Veronica pulled away from him and said she wasn't leaving, that this was her family more than it was mine, and she had every right to be here. Natalie stood up and said Veronica needed to hear something clearly. I was Natalie's husband. That meant I was family, and Veronica's refusal to accept that reality after 5 years of marriage was damaging every relationship she had. If Veronica wanted to be part of this family going forward, she needed to actually apologize for her behavior, commit to therapy, and stop this crusade against people who married into the family. Otherwise, Natalie was done trying to maintain a relationship with someone who couldn't accept her husband. Veronica looked around the table like she expected someone to defend her. Margaret and David stared back silently. Paul was there and looked uncomfortable but didn't speak up. Veronica's grandmother was sitting at the end of the table, and she was the one who finally said something. Eleanor, Margaret's mother, 92 years old and sharp as ever despite her age, told Veronica she needed to listen carefully. She said she'd been married to Natalie's grandfather for 53 years before he passed, and not once in those 53 years had her in-laws treated her like she was less than family because she wasn't born with their name. She said when she married in, they welcomed her completely, and that welcome had sustained her through decades of life together. She said Veronica's attitude toward Andrew wasn't about protecting family bonds, it was about control and fear, and the sooner Veronica recognized that, the sooner she could stop hurting the people who loved her. She said she was disappointed in her granddaughter for treating family with such cruelty. Eleanor's voice shook when she said it, and Veronica just sat there staring at her grandmother like she'd been slapped. Keith stood up and said they were leaving. This time, Veronica didn't argue. They left their sweet potato casserole on the counter and walked out while everyone sat in heavy silence. After they left, Margaret apologized to me and Natalie for the scene. Eleanor told her to stop apologizing for her daughter's behavior, that Veronica was responsible for her own choices. We finished Thanksgiving dessert with a cloud hanging over everything. Nobody wanted to talk about what had just happened, but it was all anyone could think about. I helped David clean up the kitchen while Natalie sat with Margaret and Eleanor in the living room. David told me he was sorry I'd been put through months of this treatment, that he should have stepped in earlier and shut it down. I told him it wasn't his responsibility to control his adult daughter's behavior. He said maybe not, but he was still her father, and watching her hurt people he loved made him feel like he'd failed somehow. We loaded the dishwasher in silence after that. The following week, Keith called Natalie asking if we could meet for coffee, just the three of us without Veronica. We met at a cafe on a Monday afternoon, and Keith looked exhausted. He said Veronica had been spiraling since Thanksgiving, alternating between crying about how everyone had turned against her and insisting she'd done nothing wrong. He said he'd tried to get her to see a therapist, but she refused, saying therapists would just side with everyone else against her. He asked us what we wanted from her. What would it take to fix this situation? Natalie said it would take Veronica genuinely acknowledging the specific harmful things she'd done, apologizing without justification, and committing to therapy to work through whatever was driving her behavior. Keith said he didn't know if Veronica was capable of that level of accountability right now. Natalie said then there wasn't anything to fix. Keith started crying right there in the coffee shop, saying he felt like his marriage was falling apart because his wife couldn't let go of this obsession with blood bonds and family hierarchy. That conversation with Keith stayed with me for days. Here was someone who'd been married into the family even longer than I had, and he was caught in the middle of Veronica's meltdown, trying to support his wife while watching her destroy every relationship she had. I felt bad for him. He hadn't signed up for this any more than I had, but I also recognized that he'd enabled Veronica by going along with her exclusionary behavior at the start, instead of pushing back. He'd sat at the family table while I was relegated to corner chairs. He'd supported her feelings about family boundaries when I'd called him months ago. He'd only started questioning her behavior when it got so extreme that even he couldn't justify it anymore. Still, seeing him break down in the cafe made it clear that Veronica's crusade had casualties beyond just me and Natalie. Christmas approached, and Margaret and David made the difficult decision to not host a family gathering. Margaret's treatment was taking a lot out of her, and the stress of navigating the family conflict was too much on top of managing her health. They told everyone they'd be doing a quiet Christmas, just the two of them, and people could visit separately if they wanted. Natalie and I brought presents over on Christmas Eve and spent a few hours with them. It felt hollow compared to previous years when the whole extended family would gather, but at least there was no tension or conflict. Veronica sent Margaret a gift basket with a card that said, "Thinking of you during this difficult time," with no specific mention of the cancer or the family situation. Margaret set it on the counter and didn't open it while we were there. She looked at it like it represented everything that had gone wrong. On December 30th, Veronica sent a mass email to the entire extended family. The subject line was, "Moving forward as a family." The email was 3 pages long, single-spaced, explaining her perspective on everything that had happened over the past months. She wrote about her mother's cancer diagnosis, triggering a deep examination of what family meant to her. She wrote about her concerns that the family was losing its core identity by not distinguishing between blood relatives and married-in members. She wrote about her attempts to establish healthy boundaries being misinterpreted as exclusion. She wrote about being vilified for trying to protect family legacy. The entire email was her version of events where she was the misunderstood victim trying to do what was best for everyone. At the bottom, she'd attached a link to a blog post she'd written called "Honoring Your Bloodline in Modern Families," where she advocated for creating separate tiers of family membership based on biological connection. She'd posted it publicly online. The responses to that email came fast, and they weren't kind. Eleanor responded to the whole chain, saying Veronica needed to stop embarrassing herself and the family with this nonsense. Paul responded with a warning that the blog post could be used as evidence of discriminatory intent if anyone decided to pursue legal action for harassment. Margaret's sister Angela, who I barely knew, responded asking if Veronica had completely lost her mind. Cousins I'd never met were replying saying this was the most narcissistic thing they'd ever seen. The entire extended family watched Veronica's justifications fall apart in a group email thread. Natalie forwarded me the email chain, and I read through dozens of responses from people shutting down Veronica's victim narrative and calling out her behavior for what it was. Some family members I didn't know existed were defending me and saying they were ashamed to be related to someone who'd treated a family member so cruelly. Veronica's public blog post got attention beyond the family. Someone, I never found out who, shared it on social media with commentary about toxic family dynamics. It got picked up by a few Facebook groups about narcissistic family members and controlling relatives. Strangers were commenting about their own experiences with family members who'd behaved similarly. Veronica's attempt to justify her behavior had backfired spectacularly, turning her into an internet example of how not to handle family relationships. She deleted the blog post within 48 hours, but screenshots had already been shared widely. Keith texted Natalie saying Veronica was devastated and humiliated, and asking if there was any way to make the screenshots go away. Natalie said once something was on the internet, it stayed on the internet, and maybe Veronica should have thought about that before publishing her discriminatory family philosophy online for the world to see. In early January, Veronica showed up at Margaret and David's house unannounced on a Saturday morning. Margaret called Natalie immediately after Veronica left, and Natalie put her on speaker so I could hear. Margaret said Veronica had arrived crying, saying her life was falling apart. People at her work had seen the blog post screenshots and were treating her differently. Her photography business had lost 2 clients who'd told her they weren't comfortable working with someone who had such extreme views about family. Keith was talking about separation because he couldn't handle the stress anymore. Extended family members weren't speaking to her. She was isolated and humiliated and wanted her mother's help fixing things. Margaret told Veronica the only way to fix things was to genuinely apologize and get professional help, the same thing everyone had been telling her for months. Veronica said she'd tried apologizing and nobody accepted it. Margaret said those weren't real apologies. They were justifications disguised as apologies. Veronica asked what she was supposed to do. Margaret said something that stunned me when I heard it. Margaret told Veronica She needed to write a specific, detailed apology to me, acknowledging every harmful thing she'd done, explaining why it was wrong, committing to therapy, and asking for forgiveness without expecting it to be granted. She said Veronica needed to post a public retraction of her blog post, explaining that her views were harmful and wrong. She said Veronica needed to accept that repairing relationships would take years of consistent change behavior, not just words. And she said, if Veronica wasn't willing to do those things genuinely, then Margaret needed to take some distance from their relationship, because watching her daughter behave this way was too painful on top of dealing with cancer treatment. Veronica apparently just stared at Margaret without responding, then left without saying goodbye. Margaret said she'd never set that kind of boundary with Veronica before, but she couldn't keep enabling this behavior by accepting superficial apologies and moving on like nothing had happened. 3 days later, a letter arrived at our house, handwritten, 5 pages, from Veronica. Natalie and I read it together at our kitchen table. It started with, "Dear Andrew and Natalie," and immediately acknowledged specific behaviors. She wrote about crossing out my name on the anniversary invitation. She wrote about creating the family participation agreement. She wrote about excluding me from family events and group chats. She wrote about making Keith sit at the family table while I was relegated to corner chairs. She wrote about the patio exile at the retirement party. She wrote about confronting me at the medical center. She listed everything she could remember doing over the past months. Then she tried to explain why she'd done it. She wrote about her mother's cancer diagnosis triggering existential fear about mortality and legacy. She wrote about becoming obsessed with defining family in the narrowest possible terms because it felt like something she could control when everything else felt uncertain. She wrote about realizing too late that her attempts at control had destroyed the family bonds she claimed to be protecting. The letter continued with Veronica acknowledging that her behavior had been cruel, selfish, and harmful. She said there was no justification for excluding me from the family after years of being part of it. She said her fear didn't excuse her actions. She said the blog post was embarrassing and wrong, and she'd posted a public retraction taking full responsibility for promoting harmful views about family. She said she'd started therapy the previous week with a psychologist named Dr. Michaela Torres, who specialized in anxiety and family systems. She said she didn't expect forgiveness, but she wanted us to know she understood what she'd done wrong and was committed to doing the work to become someone who didn't treat family members like that. The letter ended with, "I'm sorry," written 3 times, each on its own line. I set it down on the kitchen table and looked at Natalie. She had tears running down her face. We didn't respond to the letter immediately. Natalie wanted time to process whether the apology was genuine or just another performative attempt to make people stop being mad at her. Over the next 2 weeks, we watched Veronica's behavior from a distance. She'd posted the public retraction on the same platforms where her original blog post had appeared, acknowledging that her views about blood-based family hierarchy were wrong and harmful. She'd sent individual apology letters to Margaret, David, Keith, Eleanor, Paul, and several other family members she'd hurt with her crusade. She'd stopped posting in the family group chats entirely. Keith told Natalie that Veronica was going to therapy twice a week and was actually working on her issues instead of just venting about being misunderstood. Margaret said Veronica had called her crying and apologizing for adding stress during cancer treatment. The pattern of behavior suggested something had genuinely shifted, but neither Natalie nor I were ready to trust it yet. In late January, Veronica asked through Keith if she could meet with us in a neutral location with a mediator present. We agreed to 1 session with Dr. Foster, the family therapist Natalie and I had seen months earlier. We met on a Thursday evening at his office. Veronica looked different than the last time I'd seen her. Thinner, tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well. We sat in the same circle of chairs where I'd sat with Natalie and Margaret months ago. Dr. Foster started by establishing ground rules for the conversation. Speak from personal experience, no interrupting, focus on moving forward rather than relitigating the past. Veronica spoke first. She thanked us for being willing to meet with her. She said she'd spent the past month in therapy, unpacking why she'd behaved the way she did, and it came down to feeling like she was losing control of everything when her mother got diagnosed with cancer. She'd latched onto family hierarchy and blood bonds as something definable and controllable, and she'd used that framework to exclude anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition because it gave her a sense of power when everything else felt powerless. She said that understanding why she'd done it didn't excuse it. She said she'd hurt people she loved because she was trying to manage her own fear in the unhealthiest possible way. She looked directly at me and said she was sorry for treating me like I wasn't family when I'd been nothing but supportive and kind to everyone for years. She said she was sorry for the anniversary invitation, the family agreement, the public humiliation, the months of exclusion. She said she'd taken her trauma response and turned it into a weapon against me, and that was unforgivable. Her voice broke when she said she understood if I never wanted to be in the same room with her again, but she wanted me to know she was working on becoming someone who wouldn't do that to people. Natalie spoke next, asking Veronica directly if she actually believed I was family, or if she was just saying what we wanted to hear. Veronica took a long breath and said she believed it now, that therapy had helped her see how wrong and destructive her previous beliefs were. She said she was ashamed of the blog post and the email and all the ways she'd tried to justify her behavior publicly. I spoke last. I told Veronica I appreciated the detailed apology and the acknowledgement of specific harm. I said I was glad she was in therapy working on the underlying issues, but I also said it would take time for me to trust that this change was permanent and not just another temporary attempt to repair her reputation. I said I was willing to be civil at family gatherings and work toward rebuilding some kind of relationship eventually, but I needed to see consistent changed behavior over months, not weeks. Veronica nodded and said that was fair, that she didn't expect immediate forgiveness. Dr. Foster asked what specific changed behaviors I needed to see. I said I needed to see her treating me as an equal family member at gatherings, including me in group chats and planning, not making comments about blood bonds or family hierarchy, and continuing therapy long-term. Veronica agreed to all of it. The session ended with a plan to check in again in 3 months to see how things were progressing. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.